Elias Whitmore woke with his heart slamming against his ribs and his hand already reaching for a pencil before his eyes had fully opened. The dream had come again, sharper than ever before, and this time she had almost turned to face him. Almost. His fingers shook as he dragged a sketchbook from the floor beside his bed and began to draw, desperate to capture her before the image faded, the way it always faded, like smoke pulled apart by wind. He did not hear the knocking at first. It was only on the third round of sharp raps against his cottage door that he blinked, set down the pencil, and realized someone was outside in the cold morning air, waiting. "Elias, open this door before I break it down myself." It was Margaret, his younger sister, and there was an edge in her voice that pulled him fully out of the dream and into the present. He crossed the small room in a few steps and opened the door. She stood there with a letter clutched in her hand, her face pale, her breath visible in the chill. "What is it?" he asked, though something in his stomach had already tightened in warning. "A letter came for you from Marlow Hall." She held it out and he noticed her hand was not steady. "The seal is the Duke's own. Elias, they want you there by tomorrow evening. Tomorrow. Do you understand what that means?" He did not yet, but he took the letter and broke the wax seal with unsteady fingers. The handwriting inside was formal, clipped, urgent in its own quiet way. The Duke of Marlow required the services of a skilled portrait restorer at once. A family painting, greatly treasured, had been damaged in a fire in the east wing of the house, and the Duke wished the work completed with speed and discretion. The fee offered was more money than Elias had earned in the past 2 years combined. Margaret read his face rather than the letter. "You have to go," she said. "You know you have to go. We owe the apothecary for my medicine, and the roof needs mending before winter and—" "I know," Elias said quietly, folding the letter. "I know what it means, Margaret." But there was another reason his chest felt tight, one he did not say aloud. Marlow Hall was a great house, filled with portraits of ancestors long dead, with polished floors and cold marble halls, the kind of place that made a quiet man like him feel like an intruder in his own life. He had spent years avoiding grand commissions exactly like this one, preferring instead the smaller work of village families and modest estates, where no one looked at him too closely, and no one asked too many questions about the sketchbooks he carried everywhere and never showed to anyone. Especially not the sketchbook under his pillow, the one filled entirely with a single face drawn 100 different ways. He had begun sketching her when he was 12 years old, not long after the dream first came to him. In it he stood in a place he did not recognize, a room with tall windows and pale curtains stirring in a breeze that smelled faintly of lavender, and a woman stood with her back to him, her dark hair falling loose past her shoulders. Every year on a night close to the anniversary of his mother's passing, the dream returned, and each time the woman turned a fraction more toward him, as though something invisible was slowly unwinding, revealing her by inches. He had seen her eyes only once 3 years ago, a pale gray the color of storm clouds before rain, and he had never forgotten them. He had told no one the full truth of it, not even Margaret, though she suspected more than she let on. To speak it aloud felt like risking the last fragile thread that connected him to something he could not explain, something that felt, absurdly, more real to him than most of his waking life. "You're doing that thing again," Margaret said, watching him. "Going quiet and far away. Elias, this is a good thing, a great house, a fair fee, a chance to prove yourself beyond this village. Why do you look as though I've handed you a summons to the gallows?" He managed a small, tired smile. "I don't like grand houses, you know that." "You don't like people," she corrected gently. "Houses have never done you any harm." He could not argue with that. He packed that same afternoon, filling a worn leather case with brushes, pigments, cleaning cloths, and the tools of his trade, each item wrapped with the same careful attention he gave to everything fragile. At the very bottom, beneath a folded shirt, he placed 3 sketchbooks. 2 were filled with studies of hands, drapery, and light, the ordinary language of his craft. The third he wrapped separately in a strip of soft cloth, as though it might bruise if handled roughly. Margaret watched him from the doorway as he worked. "Will you tell them who you are, that you trained under Master Pharaoh before he passed? That alone should ease their doubts about a man from a village so small most maps forget to mark it. I'll tell them what they need to know, Elias said. Nothing more. And if they ask why a man of your skill has never sought work among the great families before now. He paused, a brush halfway into the case. Then I suppose I'll tell them the truth, that I never wanted to be looked at too closely. Margaret's expression softened, the teasing edge falling away. Is it still her, the woman in the dream? He said nothing, which was answer enough. Elias? She crossed the room and took his hand, the way she used to when they were children and their father's temper filled the house like weather. You cannot spend your whole life waiting for a face from a dream to step into it. One day you will wake up old, still sketching a stranger who may not even exist, and you will have missed every real thing standing in front of you. I know how it sounds, he said quietly. Believe me, I have told myself the same thing 100 times, but I have never once dreamed of anyone else. Not one night in 18 years. If it were only my mind playing tricks, wouldn't it have shown me someone new by now? A different face, a different place. Why always her? Why always the same room, the same light, the same eyes? Margaret had no answer for that, and they both knew it. She had grown up watching her brother fill book after book with the same woman's likeness, had watched him decline the attentions of village girls who found his quiet nature and steady hands more appealing than he ever gave himself credit for, had watched him choose solitude and old paper over anything resembling the ordinary shape of a life. She loved him too much to keep arguing a point neither of them could prove or disprove. Just be careful there, she said instead. Great houses have great secrets, and great secrets have a way of swallowing quiet men whole. He did not know, as he closed his case and looked once more around the small cottage that had been his whole world for so long, how true her warning would prove to be. The road to Marlow Hall took the better part of a day, first by cart to the coaching inn at the crossroads, then by hired carriage along a route that grew increasingly grand the farther it traveled from his village. Elias watched the countryside shift from familiar hedgerows and modest farmhouses to sweeping parkland dotted with ancient oaks, the kind of land that had belonged to the same family for so many generations the trees themselves seemed to know their names. He tried to sketch along the way, if only to calm the restless motion in his hands, but the jostling of the carriage made the lines uneven, and after a while he simply held the pencil without using it, watching the light change outside the window as afternoon slid toward evening. It was raining lightly by the time Marlow Hall came into view, and Elias found himself leaning forward despite himself, unable to look away. The house rose from the mist like something out of an old story, its gray stone walls climbing 3 full stories, its windows glowing faintly gold against the darkening sky. Rows of tall chimneys stood along the roofline like sentries, and a long gravel drive curved up toward an entrance flanked by stone columns worn smooth by centuries of weather. He had restored paintings for wealthy families before, but nothing on this scale, and as the carriage rolled to a stop before the wide steps, he felt the familiar tightness return to his chest. The sense of being smaller than his surroundings intended him to feel. A footman opened the carriage door and Elias stepped down into the cool evening air, case in hand, rain misting against his coat. He was led up the steps and through the grand entrance hall, where portraits of Marlow ancestors lined the walls in heavy gilt frames, their painted eyes seeming to track his progress with quiet judgment. He tried not to look at them too long. There was something unsettling about being watched by so many painted faces at once, all of them dead, all of them once as alive and uncertain as he felt in that moment. The housekeeper, a stern but not unkind woman named Mrs. Bellamy, met him near the base of the grand staircase and explained in brisk and efficient tones the details of his commission. The damaged painting, a portrait of the current Duke's grandfather, had been kept in the East Wing Gallery, a section of the house that had suffered smoke and minor fire damage some weeks prior. The Duke wished the restoration completed quietly, without fuss, and without disruption to the household. Elias would be given a room near the gallery itself, so that he might work at whatever hours suited him best, and his meals would be brought to him separately unless he preferred otherwise. "The Duke himself will wish to see you tomorrow," Mrs. Bellamy added, leading him up a narrower staircase toward the east wing. He does not often take interest in the details of household repairs, but this painting held great meaning for his late mother, and he has asked to be informed of your progress personally. Elias nodded, only half listening, his attention caught instead by the sound of the storm outside growing heavier against the tall windows they passed. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, low and long, and rain began to lash the glass in earnest. "We were not expecting the weather to turn so quickly," Mrs. Bellamy said, glancing toward a window with faint concern. "There is another guest expected tonight, arriving late from the north. I do hope the roads hold." Elias said nothing, though something in her words settled uneasily in his chest, a small prickling sense he could not name. He followed her the rest of the way to his room in silence, and once alone, he set down his case, lit the single candle left for him on the writing desk, and sat for a long moment simply listening to the storm. It was nearing 11 when he heard the commotion below. Voices, footsteps hurrying across stone floors, the heavy front door opening against wind and rain. Curiosity, or perhaps something less easily explained, drew him from his room and partway down the narrow staircase that overlooked a section of the entrance hall. He told himself he only wished to see if the household required an extra pair of hands, though even as he descended he knew that was not quite true. Something in him, some instinct he did not fully trust, pulled him toward the sound of that arrival the way a compass needle turns without asking permission. He reached the landing just as the great doors below swung open, and a gust of wind and rain rushed into the hall, extinguishing 2 of the nearest candles. A footman rushed forward with an umbrella too late to be of any use, and a woman stepped down from the carriage into the light of the hall, soaked through, her dark hair plastered against her face and neck, her traveling cloak heavy with rain. She lifted her head to thank the footman for his trouble, and in that single motion, in the turn of her chin and the lift of her eyes toward the candlelight, Elias Whitmore felt the floor of his entire life tilt beneath him. It was her. The eyes were the same pale, storm gray he had drawn 1,000 times from memory. The line of her jaw, the particular way her dark hair curled slightly at the ends even when wet, the small crease that appeared between her brows when she was uncertain of her surroundings, exactly as it appeared now while she looked around the unfamiliar hall. Every detail he had captured across 18 years of half-remembered dreams stood before him in flesh and rainwater, real in a way that made his breath catch painfully in his throat. He must have made some sound, some small noise of shock, because she looked up toward the staircase, toward him, and their eyes met across the candle-lit distance of the hall. For one impossible moment, neither of them moved. Then Mrs. Bellamy's voice cut through the silence, warm and welcoming as she hurried forward. "Lady Cassandra, we had begun to worry with the storm turning so fierce. Come in, you must be chilled through." Lady Cassandra Hale. The name settled into Elias' mind even as his eyes remained fixed on her face, unable to look away, unable to fully believe what stood before him. She offered Mrs. Bellamy a small, polite smile, though her gaze flicked once more toward the staircase, toward the strange, pale artist frozen halfway down the steps, staring at her as though she were a ghost risen from some private grave. She did not know him. That much was clear in the faint, questioning tilt of her head, the polite confusion of someone encountering a stranger's unexplained stare. She had no memory of storm-gray eyes drawn 1,000 times by candlelight in a small cottage far away. No knowledge of the years he had spent chasing the edges of a dream that had, impossibly, just walked through the front doors of Marlow Hall. But Elias knew her. He had known her in some fashion for 18 years. And as the footman hurried to close the great doors against the storm, and Mrs. Bellamy ushered the soaked and shivering young woman toward the warmth of the fire, Elias remained on the staircase a moment longer, gripping the banister as though the house itself might tilt him off his feet entirely. He did not yet know why she had come to Marlow Hall, what circumstance or family tie had brought her through its doors on the same night he himself had arrived, nor did he understand what unseen hand had guided 2 strangers, bound by a dream neither could explain, toward the same storm-lit hall on the same rain-drenched evening. He only knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that his quiet, solitary life had changed forever the moment Lady Cassandra Hale looked up and met his eyes. Sleep did not come easily that night. Elias lay awake long after the storm had softened into a steady patter against the window panes, staring at the ceiling of his unfamiliar room, turning the evening over in his mind again and again like a coin he could not stop flipping. He told himself more than once that exhaustion from the journey had played tricks on his eyes, that grief and years of longing had finally conjured a resemblance where none truly existed. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her again, exactly as she had looked in the candlelight, and he knew with a certainty that frightened him that no trick of exhaustion could explain such precision. By the time gray morning light crept through the curtains, he had convinced himself of only one thing. He needed to see her again, if only to prove to himself that his memory had exaggerated the resemblance overnight, the way memories so often did. He rose early, dressed, and made his way down to the East Wing gallery, where the damaged portrait of the late Duke's grandfather awaited his attention. The fire had scorched one corner of the canvas badly, the paint blistered and cracked along the edge, while soot had dulled the surface across the rest of the piece. It was delicate work, the kind that demanded patience and a steady hand, and Elias was grateful for the distraction it offered, even as part of his mind remained fixed on the staircase, on rain-soaked dark hair, on eyes the color of a coming storm. He had been working for perhaps an hour, carefully testing solvents on an inconspicuous corner of the frame, when a voice startled him from behind. "You must be the restorer Mrs. Bellamy mentioned." He turned quickly, nearly upsetting a small dish of cleaning solution, and found himself facing a tall man of perhaps 40 years, dressed in the quiet, well-cut clothes of someone who did not need to announce his wealth to be believed. His bearing was unmistakably that of a man accustomed to command, though his expression held more curiosity than authority. "Your Grace," Elias set down his tools and offered a bow, hoping his voice did not betray the unsteadiness still lingering from the previous night. "Elias Whitmore. I arrived yesterday evening, as your letter requested." Edmund Ashcombe, Duke of Marlow, studied him for a long moment, his gaze moving from Elias' face to the half-cleaned canvas beside him, assessing both with the same careful attention. "You came recommended by Lord Pelham, who spoke highly of your work restoring the chapel windows on his estate. He does not offer praise easily, so I confess I expected someone older." "I trained under Master Pharaoh for 6 years before his passing," Elias said. "He believed skill mattered more than age, your Grace, though I understand the doubt is a fair one." Something in the Duke's expression eased slightly, a faint approval settling into the lines around his eyes. "Master Pharaoh, yes, I recall the name. My mother thought highly of his restoration work at the cathedral in the north. If he trained you, then I have less cause for concern than I believed this morning." He glanced toward the damaged portrait, his expression shifting into something more somber. This painting held great meaning for her. She sat beside it often in her final years, though she never explained why, beyond saying it reminded her of a promise made long before I was born. "I would see it restored properly, whatever the cost, and whatever the time required." "I intend to give it exactly that care, your Grace," Elias said, and meant it fully, grateful for once to speak plainly about something he understood far better than the tangled feelings still knotted in his chest. The Duke seemed satisfied with the answer, and after a few more practical questions about materials and timeline, he turned to leave, then paused at the gallery door as though remembering something. "You will likely encounter my cousin about the house during your stay. Lady Cassandra arrived last night in wretched weather, poor thing, and will be staying with us for some time while certain family matters are settled. I mention it only so you are not startled by an unfamiliar face wandering these halls." Elias' hand stilled over his tools. "Of course, your Grace." If the Duke noticed anything unusual in his tone, he gave no sign of it, offering only a brief nod before departing down the corridor, his footsteps fading into the vast quiet of the house. Elias remained still for a long moment after he had gone, absorbing the small, strange confirmation that Lady Cassandra Hale was, in fact, real, present, and staying under the same roof for reasons the Duke had described only in the vaguest terms. Certain family matters. The phrase offered nothing and everything at once, and Elias found himself turning it over with the same restless curiosity he usually reserved for unraveling the layers of an old, damaged painting. He did not see her again until midday, when hunger finally drew him from the gallery in search of the kitchens. He had not intended to take the corridor that passed the library, but something, whether chance or the house's own strange design, led his feet that direction regardless. Through the open library doors, he caught sight of her seated at a long table, surrounded by stacks of ledgers and loose papers, her dark hair now dry and pinned neatly at the back of her head, a small furrow of concentration between her brows as she worked. He should have walked past. He told himself quite firmly that he would walk past. Instead, he stopped in the doorway, and she looked up as though she had felt his presence before hearing it, her gray eyes meeting his for the second time in less than a day. "You're the artist," she said, not unkindly, setting down her pen. "The one from the staircase last night. You looked as though you had seen a spirit." Heat rose to his face despite his best effort to appear composed. "My apologies, my lady. I did not mean to stare. The storm had unsettled everyone, I think, and I was not expecting an arrival so late in the evening." It was not entirely a lie, though it was far from the truth, and he suspected from the slight narrowing of her eyes that she sensed as much. "You may enter properly, if you wish, rather than haunting my doorway," she said, a faint note of amusement threading through her words. "I confess I could use a distraction from these ledgers. Cataloging an entire family's art collection is far duller work than I imagined when I agreed to it." He hesitated only a moment before stepping inside, setting his hunger aside entirely in favor of the strange, magnetic pull that had guided him there in the first place. "You are cataloging the collection yourself?" "My cousin the Duke insists I have a fair eye for such things, and I confess I enjoy the work more than I let on, though I admit I know little of proper restoration, which I understand is your particular skill." She studied him with open curiosity now, tilting her head slightly in a gesture so achingly familiar to him that his chest tightened all over again. "Forgive me, but you continue to look at me as though searching for something. Have we met before, Mr. Whitmore?" "I do not recall it if we have, though perhaps you attended some gathering I have forgotten." "No," he said carefully, choosing his words with the caution of a man walking across thin ice. "We have never met, my lady." "I would remember." Something in his tone made her pause, her curiosity sharpening rather than fading. That is an odd thing to say with such certainty. He searched for some safer path through the conversation and found none readily available, so he offered instead a partial truth, hoping it might satisfy her without revealing too much. "Forgive me. I have an artist's habit of studying faces closely, sometimes too closely for polite company. It is not the first time I have been accused of staring." She studied him a moment longer, clearly unconvinced but too well-mannered to press further, and gestured instead toward the chair across from her. "Sit, if you like. I would rather have company than these dusty old records, however strange that company happens to be." He sat, and for the better part of an hour they spoke of small, ordinary things. The history of certain paintings in the collection, the strange chill of the East Wing even in summer, the way the house seemed to hold its breath during storms, as though listening for something long overdue. Elias found himself relaxing by degrees, drawn into the easy rhythm of her conversation, the quick wit that surfaced whenever she described some particularly tedious ledger entry, the warmth that softened her formal manner the longer they spoke. He learned that she had grown up largely in the North, raised by an aunt after the early loss of both her parents, and that her arrival at Marlow Hall had come at the Duke's own insistence, though she offered no further detail on the matter, her expression closing slightly whenever the subject drew too near. He did not press her, recognizing in that guarded shift something of his own reluctance to speak too freely of matters that felt too large, too strange, to explain to a stranger over an afternoon's conversation. It was only when the light through the tall windows began to shift toward late afternoon that he realized how much time had passed, and how comfortable, how unexpectedly easy, the hours had become. "I should return to the gallery," he said, rising reluctantly. "The Duke has asked for steady progress on the restoration." "Of course." She rose as well, and for a moment neither of them moved toward the door, caught in a silence that felt heavier than the conversation preceding it. "I find myself glad of the company today, Mr. Whitmore. This house can feel rather large and empty for all its grandeur." "I understand that feeling better than you might expect," he said quietly, and meant every word. She smiled then, a small, genuine thing that reached her eyes and undid something carefully guarded in his chest. "Perhaps I will visit the gallery tomorrow, if you would not mind an audience. I confess I am curious to see how such delicate work is done." "You would be welcome," he said, and left before he could say anything more revealing than he already had. That evening, alone in his room with the candle burned low, Elias took out the wrapped sketchbook from the bottom of his case for the first time since arriving at Marlow Hall. He turned the pages slowly, past years of half-remembered dreams rendered in careful pencil, past 100 versions of a face he now knew belonged to a living, breathing woman who had smiled at him across a library table only hours before. He did not know what force had guided her to Marlow Hall on the very night of his own arrival, nor what tangled family matters had brought her beneath the Duke's roof under circumstances no one seemed willing to fully explain. He knew only that the dream which had shaped the whole of his solitary life had finally, impossibly, stepped into it, and that nothing about the quiet, careful existence he had built for himself would ever be quite the same again. Outside, the storm had long since passed, leaving the night clear and star-scattered above Marlow Hall, though Elias, staring down at page after page of a face he had drawn 1,000 times before ever knowing her name, felt as though the real storm had only just begun. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither Elias nor Cassandra had planned, yet neither seemed willing to disturb. Each morning he worked in the gallery, coaxing the scorched portrait back toward its former dignity, layer by careful layer, and each afternoon she found some reason to visit, whether to consult him about a cataloging question or simply to sit nearby with her ledgers while he worked in companionable silence. Mrs. Bellamy noticed, as housekeepers in great houses always notice such things, though she said nothing beyond the occasional knowing glance whenever she brought tea to the gallery and found them deep in conversation, heads bent close over some detail of paint or provenance. It was on the 5th day that the rhythm broke, and the quiet world Elias had begun to believe in cracked slightly at its edges. He heard the commotion before he understood its cause, a stir of activity in the entrance hall below, footmen hurrying with trunks, the Duke's voice raised in formal greeting. Curious, he set down his brush and made his way to the gallery's tall window, which overlooked the front drive, and watched as a fine carriage rolled to a stop, its crest unfamiliar to him but clearly significant, judging by the flurry of attention it drew from the household staff. A man stepped down from the carriage, tall and confident, dressed in the sharp, fashionable cut of someone who spent as much time in the city as in the country. He greeted the Duke with easy familiarity, the kind that spoke of long acquaintance, and Elias watched with a tightening unease as the man's gaze swept across the front of the house and settled, with evident satisfaction, upon a figure he had not noticed standing near the entrance steps. Cassandra. She had come out to greet the new arrival, and though her posture remained politely composed, Elias noticed the stiffness in her shoulders, the careful, practiced smile she offered that did not quite reach her eyes. The man took her hand and bowed over it with a familiarity that made something sharp and unfamiliar twist in Elias' chest, an emotion he recognized with some discomfort as jealousy, however unearned he told himself it was. He learned the man's name that evening, when Mrs. Bellamy brought his supper to the gallery, as had become their habit. "Lord Grenville has arrived," she said, setting down the tray with a faint frown that suggested her own opinion of the guest, though she was too discreet to voice it plainly. "A connection of the family through his late mother's side. He visits Marlow Hall from time to time, though I confess I have never much cared for the way he looks at people, as though calculating their worth to the last shilling. Elias said nothing, though the observation lodged itself uncomfortably in his thoughts. He did not see Cassandra again that evening, nor the following morning, and by midday, restless and unable to concentrate fully on his work, he allowed himself to seek her out, telling himself it was only ordinary concern for a friend, nothing more. He found her in the garden, seated alone on a stone bench beneath a bare autumn tree, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill, her expression distant in a way that struck him immediately as troubled. "Lady Cassandra," he approached slowly, unsure of his welcome, "forgive me if I intrude." She looked up, and something in her face eased slightly at the sight of him, though the shadow behind her eyes did not fully lift. "You do not intrude, Mr. Whitmore. I confess I am glad of the company, though I fear I would be poor company in return today." He sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort but careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Lord Grenville's arrival has unsettled you." It was not quite a question, and she did not treat it as one, her jaw tightening slightly at the name. "You are perceptive. You need not explain if you would rather not." "No," she said after a long moment, "I find I would rather explain, strange as that may sound to a man I have known scarcely a week." She drew a slow breath, gathering her thoughts. "My family's fortunes have never been entirely secure, Mr. Whitmore. My father died deeply in debt, and though my aunt raised me with kindness, she had little to offer beyond affection. My connection to the Duke, through my mother's line, is the only true inheritance I possess, and it comes with certain expectations attached, whether I welcome them or not." "Expectations such as Lord Grenville," Elias said quietly, understanding beginning to settle heavily into his chest. "He is a distant cousin of my late mother, and a man of considerable standing, whatever else might be said of him. My family has long hoped for a match between us, believing it would secure both our futures and settle certain old debts owed between our two houses. I have resisted the notion for years, but I fear my resistance grows harder to maintain the longer I remain unmarried and dependent upon the goodwill of relations." Her voice had grown quieter, more careful, and Elias found himself leaning slightly closer without quite meaning to. "That is, in truth, part of the reason I have come to Marlow Hall. My aunt believed a change of scenery might soften my objections. Instead, it seems Lord Grenville has simply followed." Elias absorbed this in silence, turning the pieces over carefully before speaking. "And does your heart have no say in the matter at all?" She looked at him then, something sharp and searching in her gray eyes, as though the question had caught her by surprise. "It is not often anyone asks me that directly. I am asking now." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "My heart, Mr. Whitmore, has always felt somewhat out of step with the rest of me. I have never been able to explain it properly, not even to myself, but I have long felt as though I were waiting for something or someone I could not quite name. It has made every practical match offered to me feel like settling for less than what I was owed, though I could never say precisely why I felt so certain of that." She laughed softly, though there was little humor in the sound. "It is a foolish thing to admit aloud. A woman in my position cannot afford to wait for feelings she cannot even properly describe." Elias' chest had gone tight and strange, a wild, impossible hope rising in him that he immediately tried to suppress, certain he was reading far more into her words than she intended. "It does not sound foolish to me," he said carefully. "I understand that particular kind of waiting rather better than you might expect." She studied him for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them in the cold autumn air, before the sound of approaching footsteps on the garden path broke the fragile stillness entirely. "Cassandra," Lord Grenville's voice carried easily across the garden, warm and confident, though his eyes, when they landed on Elias, held a cooler assessment entirely. "I had hoped to find you before the afternoon grew too cold. Your cousin mentioned you often walk here." Cassandra rose at once, her posture straightening into the practiced formality Elias had first seen upon the man's arrival. "Lord Grenville, may I present Mr. Whitmore, the artist currently restoring the damaged portrait in the East Gallery." Grenville's gaze swept over Elias with the brief, dismissive thoroughness of a man cataloging something beneath his notice, before returning to Cassandra with far greater interest. A restorer. How fortunate the household has found competent help. I trust the work progresses well. Quite well, my lord, Elias said evenly, rising to his feet as manners demanded, though every instinct in him wished to remain seated between Grenville and the woman beside him. Good, good. Grenville offered him little further attention, turning instead to Cassandra with an easy familiarity that made Elias' jaw tighten. Might I steal you for a walk before the light fades entirely? I have scarcely had a moment alone with you since my arrival, and I confess I have missed our conversations. Cassandra hesitated, her eyes flicking briefly toward Elias before settling back on Grenville with careful composure. Of course, my lord. Mr. Whitmore, I thank you for the company. I hope we might speak again soon. I would welcome it, Elias said, and watched, with an ache he had no right to feel, as she walked away beside a man whose confident stride and easy charm seemed built, quite deliberately, to claim ground he had no true right to claim. He returned to the gallery that afternoon unable to focus properly on his work, his brush hovering uselessly over the canvas, while his thoughts circled endlessly around the conversation in the garden. He had known, in some distant, cautious part of himself, that a woman of Cassandra's standing would have suitors, obligations, a life shaped by expectations far beyond his own quiet existence. But knowing a thing and watching it unfold before his eyes proved to be entirely different burdens to carry. That evening, unable to settle, he took out the wrapped sketchbook once more, turning slowly through its pages by candlelight. He paused on an early sketch, drawn when he was perhaps 16, of the woman's eyes alone, rendered again and again in careful shading, as though even then some part of him had understood how much would eventually depend upon that particular shade of gray. He did not know what claim, if any, he truly had upon Cassandra Hale, beyond the strange and unprovable bond of a shared dream neither of them fully understood. He was a village artist, however skilled, and she was cousin to a duke, courted by men of standing and fortune he could never hope to match. Yet as he closed the sketchbook and set it carefully aside, he found he could not make himself believe, however sensible the doubt, that 18 years of longing had led him to Marlow Hall merely to watch her married away to Lord Grenville. Something larger was unfolding beneath the surface of the house. He was certain of it now, some old thread connecting his dreams to her arrival, to the Duke's careful watchfulness, to the very portrait he had been summoned to restore. He did not yet know its shape, but he intended, whatever the cost to his composure, to follow it until he understood. Outside, the wind picked up against the windows, rattling the old glass in its frame, and somewhere below in the house, faint and distant, he thought he heard the sound of Cassandra's laughter, quickly followed by silence. The following week brought little relief from the tension that had settled over Marlow Hall since Lord Grenville's arrival. He seemed to appear wherever Cassandra went, joining her for breakfast, accompanying her on errands about the estate, filling the hours Elias had once shared with her in the gallery or the library. Elias told himself, with as much discipline as he could muster, that it was not his place to resent the man's presence, that Cassandra's future was hers to determine, whatever quiet ache the arrangement stirred in his chest. Still, he noticed things he wished he had not. The way Cassandra's smile, when directed at Grenville, never quite reached the warmth it held when she spoke with Elias in the gallery. The way her shoulders relaxed visibly whenever Grenville left a room, as though she had been holding some invisible weight the entire time he remained present. He told himself these were small, meaningless observations, the kind of thing a man convinces himself of when his own feelings have grown too large to trust his judgment. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, while Elias worked carefully on the final stages of the portrait's restoration, that the fragile order of his private world came undone entirely. He had left his room briefly that morning, called away to consult with the Duke about a matter of framing materials, and had returned to find his door slightly ajar, though he was certain he had closed it properly before leaving. A small unease prickled at the back of his neck as he stepped inside, and it sharpened considerably when he saw his case sitting open on the writing desk, its contents disturbed from their usual careful order. His heart sank as his eyes fell upon the wrapped sketchbook, no longer wrapped, lying open on the desk with its pages exposed. Cassandra stood beside it, very still, her face pale, one hand pressed against her mouth as though to keep some sound from escaping. She looked up as he entered, and the expression in her eyes, a tangled mixture of shock, confusion, and something rawer he could not immediately name, told him instantly that whatever fragile balance had existed between them until that moment had shattered entirely. Cassandra, her name left him before he could stop it, stripped of its proper title entirely, and she flinched slightly at the sound. "I came to bring you a note from Mrs. Bellamy about supper arrangements," she said, her voice unsteady, gesturing vaguely toward a folded paper on the desk he had not noticed until then. The door was open. I did not mean to pry, I swear it, but the book had fallen partly open on the desk, and I saw. She stopped, swallowing hard, her gaze dropping back to the open page before her. "Elias, this is my face." He crossed the room slowly, as though approaching something fragile enough to shatter with a wrong movement, and looked down at the page she indicated. It was one of his earliest sketches, drawn when he was perhaps 14, the lines less confident than his later work, but the likeness unmistakable even then. Beneath it, in his own careful, youthful handwriting, he had noted the date, years before he had ever set foot inside Marlow Hall, years before Cassandra Hale had existed to him as anything beyond a face glimpsed in dreams. How is this possible? She turned the pages with trembling hands, moving through years of sketches, each one capturing some detail of her face he could not possibly have known before their meeting. The small scar near her left eyebrow, faint enough that most would never notice it, the particular curve of her smile when something genuinely amused her rather than politeness demanding a response. "These dates, Elias, some of these are from a decade ago. I was a child myself when you drew this one. We had never met." "We could not possibly have met." He sat down heavily in the chair beside the desk, the weight of years of careful silence finally too much to maintain. "I know how it sounds," he said quietly. "Believe me, I have spent my entire life knowing exactly how it sounds, and I have told no one the full truth of it beyond my sister, who has long since stopped asking me to explain it in terms that make sense." "Then explain it to me," Cassandra said, sitting slowly across from him, the sketchbook still open in her lap. "Please, I think I deserve that much, given what I have just found." And so, for the first time since childhood, Elias told the full truth of it aloud. He told her of the dream that had come to him since he was 12 years old, always on the same night each year, always in the same pale room with tall windows and lavender-scented air. He told her of the woman who stood with her back to him at first, turning only by degrees across the passing years, revealing herself so slowly that he had spent nearly 2 decades filling sketchbooks with fragments before ever seeing her whole. He told her of the eyes he had drawn 100 times before ever learning their true color, of the small crease between her brows he had captured long before understanding what expression produced it. Cassandra listened in silence, her expression shifting through disbelief, confusion, and something that eventually settled into a kind of stunned, careful attention, as though she were assembling some private puzzle of her own alongside his words. When he finished, the room fell into a heavy quiet, broken only by the faint sound of wind against the windows. "I have to tell you something," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I fear you will think me either mad or a liar, though I promise I am neither." "I am hardly in a position to judge," he said gently. She drew a slow breath, gathering courage for whatever she intended to say next. "I have dreamed of a man's hands for as long as I can properly remember. Not his face, not fully, not until recently, but his hands always sketching, always moving across paper with a kind of quiet, careful patience I have never seen matched in waking life. I used to think it a strange, meaningless fancy of childhood, the sort of thing most people forget as they grow older. But the dream never left me, Elias. It returned again and again every year, always on a night close to the anniversary of my father's death, and in recent years the face above those hands began to grow clearer, until—" she stopped, staring at him with an expression caught somewhere between wonder and fear. "Until it became yours." Elias felt the breath leave his chest entirely, a strange lightness rushing through him even as his mind struggled to grasp the full shape of what she had just revealed. "You dreamed of me." "I dreamed of someone drawing me," she corrected softly, "for years without ever understanding who or why or what it meant. I told no one for the same reasons you told no one, I imagine." It felt too strange, too impossible to speak aloud without inviting doubt or ridicule. She looked down at the sketchbook still open across her lap, her fingers tracing gently over the edge of a page without quite touching the drawing itself. "I did not believe, until this very moment, that such a thing could be shared between two people who had never properly met." They sat together in silence for a long while after that, the weight of the revelation settling slowly between them, neither entirely certain what to say next in the face of something so far beyond ordinary explanation. Elias watched her carefully, searching her face for any sign of the fear or doubt he half expected, and found instead something closer to quiet astonishment, the careful, dawning recognition of a mystery finally beginning to resolve itself after years of unanswered questions. "I do not understand what this means," Cassandra said eventually, closing the sketchbook with careful, deliberate gentleness, as though it had become something precious rather than merely startling. "But I find I no longer wish to dismiss it as coincidence or fancy, however sensible that dismissal might once have seemed." "Nor do I," Elias said quietly. "I have spent 18 years trying to explain it away, and I confess I have run out of patience for that particular exercise." A faint, tremulous smile touched her lips, the first genuine warmth he had seen from her since entering the room and finding his private world exposed upon the desk between them. "Then perhaps, Mr. Whitmore, we ought to stop trying to explain it, and simply allow ourselves to discover what it means instead." Outside, the afternoon light had begun to shift toward evening, casting long shadows across the room, and somewhere below in the house, Elias could faintly hear the sound of Lord Grenville's voice calling for Cassandra, a reminder that whatever strange and impossible bond had just been uncovered between them, the ordinary world beyond that room had not paused to accommodate it. Cassandra rose slowly, gathering herself with visible effort, though her eyes lingered on Elias a moment longer than propriety strictly required. "I should go before I am missed," she said softly. "But Elias, I do not intend to pretend this afternoon did not happen. Whatever this is, whatever strange thread connects us, I find I am no longer willing to walk away from it without understanding it fully." "Nor am I," he said, and watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her, leaving him alone once more with a sketchbook that no longer felt like a private, impossible secret, but the first fragile thread of something he had spent his entire life waiting, without fully understanding, to find. News of the private conversation in Elias' room did not spread through the household, for neither he nor Cassandra spoke of it to anyone else, but something in the air between them shifted so visibly over the following days that even Mrs. Bellamy began casting curious glances their way whenever they crossed paths. Lord Grenville, too, seemed to sense the change, though he could not have named its cause, and his attentions toward Cassandra grew noticeably more insistent, as though he sensed some rival presence he could not properly identify. It was the Duke himself who finally brought matters into the open, summoning Elias to his study on a gray, overcast morning nearly 2 weeks after Cassandra's arrival. Elias entered to find Edmund Ashcombe seated behind a heavy oak desk, the damaged portrait's restoration nearly complete propped nearby for inspection, though the Duke's attention, when Elias entered, remained fixed not on the painting but on him directly, with an expression far more searching than any he had offered before. "Sit, Mr. Whitmore," the Duke said, gesturing toward a chair across the desk. "I find myself in need of a conversation I confess I did not anticipate having when I first summoned you to this house." Elias sat carefully, unease prickling at the back of his neck. "Your Grace." "My cousin has changed since your arrival," the Duke said plainly, folding his hands atop the desk. "I do not say this as accusation but as observation, and I would ask you to be honest with me regarding its cause, given the delicacy of her situation here." Elias hesitated, weighing carefully how much truth the moment demanded. "I hold your cousin in the highest regard, Your Grace. I have never intended to overstep the boundaries of my position within this household." "That is not quite an answer to what I asked," the Duke said, though not unkindly, "but I appreciate the caution behind it." He rose, moving toward the restored portrait, studying it with an expression that had grown suddenly distant, thoughtful. "Do you know, Mr. Whitmore, why this particular painting held such meaning for my late mother?" "I do not, Your Grace." "It is a portrait of my grandfather, painted in his youth, before he inherited the title. My mother kept it near her always, though she rarely spoke of the reason beyond a vague reference to a promise made long before her own birth." The Duke turned back toward Elias, his expression carefully measured. "I only recently learned the fuller story, from letters left among her private papers after her passing. It seems my grandfather in his youth was deeply attached to a woman of lesser standing, a woman his family considered unsuitable for marriage, given the difference in their circumstances. He was pressured, quite firmly, into a more advantageous match instead, and the woman he had loved was sent away, her family compensated to ensure her silence and departure from the district entirely." Elias felt a strange, cold, prickling settle across his skin, some instinct warning him that this history, however distant, bore some deeper relevance to the conversation than the Duke's measured tone yet revealed. "My grandfather never fully recovered from the loss according to my mother's letters," the Duke continued. "He kept this portrait as a private reminder of the choice he had been forced into, and on his deathbed he made my mother promise that should any descendant of that woman ever have need of the family's help, it would be given without hesitation or condition." He paused, studying Elias closely. "The woman's name, Mr. Whitmore, was Eleanor Hale." The name landed heavily in the quiet study, and Elias understood, with a slow, dawning clarity, exactly why the Duke had summoned him. "Cassandra's family," Elias said quietly. "Her great-grandmother," the Duke confirmed. "My mother traced the line carefully before her passing, ensuring the promise would be honored should the need ever arise. When Cassandra's circumstances grew difficult following her father's death, I offered her a place here, in part out of genuine family feeling, and in part to honor a debt owed across generations, one my grandfather never forgave himself for failing to properly settle." Elias sat in stunned silence, pieces of the impossible puzzle he had carried for 18 years beginning, at last, to align into something resembling shape. "Your Grace, forgive me, but might I ask what became of Eleanor Hale after she was sent away?" "She married eventually, according to the records, into a family of modest standing in the north. A family of artists, as it happens, skilled in portraiture and restoration work, much like your own trade, Mr. Whitmore." The Duke's gaze had sharpened considerably, watching Elias' reaction with careful attention. "I confess I did not think much of the coincidence when Lord Pelham first recommended your services, beyond noting it as a curious detail. But given what I have observed between you and my cousin these past 2 weeks, I find myself wondering whether coincidence is quite the correct word for what has unfolded within these walls." Elias' mind raced backward through everything he knew of his own family history, the fragmented details his mother had shared before her passing, the vague understanding that his family's artistic tradition stretched back further than anyone had properly recorded. He had never known the name of the ancestor who had first brought painting into his family's blood, only that she had married into modest circumstances after some unspoken sorrow in her youth. "Your Grace," he said slowly, his voice unsteady with the weight of dawning realization, "I believe Eleanor Hale may have been my own great-great-grandmother." The Duke's expression shifted into something between vindication and quiet astonishment. "Then it seems, Mr. Whitmore, that whatever bond exists between you and my cousin runs considerably deeper than either of you likely understood upon your first meeting in this house." The revelation settled over Elias with a strange, dizzying clarity, as though some vast, invisible pattern had finally been illuminated after years spent stumbling blindly through its edges. The dream that had haunted him since childhood, the shared vision that had connected him to Cassandra across years of separate lives, suddenly felt less like an inexplicable mystery, and more like the echo of an old, unfinished story finally seeking its resolution, generations after the promise between their families had first been broken. "Does Lady Cassandra know of this history?" Elias asked. "Not yet," the Duke admitted. "I had intended to tell her eventually, though I confess I did not anticipate the timing being quite so significant." He studied Elias a moment longer, his earlier caution softening into something more genuinely warm. "I will leave the manner and timing of that conversation to your discretion, Mr. Whitmore, though I suspect, given what has already passed between you both, she deserves to hear it soon." Elias left the study in a daze, the weight of the revelation settling slowly through him as he made his way back toward the gallery, his mind turning over every detail of the Duke's account, searching for its connection to the dream that had shaped so much of his solitary life. He found Cassandra in the library, as had become their habit, and the moment she looked up and saw his expression, she set down her pen immediately, sensing without needing to ask that something significant had occurred. "Elias, what is it?" He sat across from her, and told her everything the Duke had shared, watching her expression shift through disbelief, wonder, and finally a kind of quiet, tearful recognition, as the pieces of her own family's fragmented history settled into place alongside his. "Eleanor Hale," she said softly once he had finished. "I know that name. My aunt mentioned her once in passing, though she claimed to know little beyond a vague family rumor of some old heartbreak, long buried and rarely discussed." She shook her head slowly, wonder plain across her face. "I never imagined it might connect to anything beyond old family gossip, let alone to you, Elias, to us." "Nor did I," he admitted. "Though I confess it explains a great deal that I have spent my entire life unable to understand." She reached across the table then, her hand settling gently over his, the gesture simple and unguarded in a way that felt far more significant than any words either of them might have offered instead. "Perhaps this is what the dream was always trying to tell us," she said quietly. "Not merely a connection between two strangers, but the echo of a story left unfinished, waiting patiently across generations for someone to finally see it through to its proper end." Elias turned his hand beneath hers, allowing their fingers to interlace fully for the first time, and felt, in that small, quiet gesture, the culmination of 18 years of longing finally beginning to settle into something real, something solid, something no longer confined to the uncertain edges of dreams and half-remembered sketches. But even as the warmth of that moment settled between them, a shadow remained at the edge of Elias' thoughts, one he could not fully set aside. Lord Grenville remained at Marlow Hall, his intentions toward Cassandra unchanged by any revelation of old family history, and Elias suspected, with a growing unease he could not quite shake, that a man so evidently determined in his pursuit would not step aside easily, whatever old promises or shared dreams stood in his path. Elias' unease proved well-founded sooner than he expected. Only 2 days after the revelation in the study, he was summoned unexpectedly to the drawing room, where he found Lord Grenville waiting alone, his expression carrying none of the easy charm he had displayed since his arrival. In its place was something colder, more calculating, the look of a man who had grown tired of pretending patience he did not truly possess. "Mr. Whitmore," Grenville said, not bothering to rise from his seat as Elias entered, "I understand congratulations may be in order for the successful restoration of the Duke's portrait. I trust your business here is nearly concluded." "The work is finished, my lord," Elias said carefully, sensing the true purpose of the conversation lay well beyond polite discussion of his commission, "though the Duke has not yet indicated when he wishes me to depart." "No," Grenville said, something sharp flickering behind his eyes. "I imagine he is not, given how thoroughly you have made yourself at home within these walls." He rose slowly, moving toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of deliberate composure. "I will speak plainly, Mr. Whitmore, as I suspect subtlety has already failed to achieve the desired effect. Lady Cassandra's future has been long settled between our two families, a matter of considerable financial and social importance that predates your arrival here by many years. I do not intend to see it undone by an infatuation, however charmingly you and my cousin's ward have managed to dress it up as fate." Elias kept his expression carefully neutral, though anger stirred beneath the surface of his composure. "Lady Cassandra's future is hers to determine, my lord, whatever arrangements may have been discussed on her behalf." "How romantically simple you make it sound," Grenville said, a humorless smile touching his lips. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, do you know the true state of my family's finances, or Cassandra's? Her father left considerable debts behind him, debts her aunt has managed only through careful, quiet arrangement with my own family over the years. A match between us would settle those debts entirely, securing not only her future but her aunt's modest household as well. Without it, I fear certain obligations may come due rather more publicly than anyone would prefer." His gaze sharpened. "I trust you understand my meaning." The threat, thinly veiled behind formal language, landed with unmistakable clarity. Elias felt his jaw tighten, though he forced his voice to remain level. "You would ruin her aunt's household to force Lady Cassandra's hand." "I would prefer not to," Grenville said, his tone almost bored, as though discussing a matter of little consequence. "But I have obligations of my own, Mr. Whitmore, and patience that grows thinner by the day. I suggest you consider carefully whether whatever fanciful notions you and Lady Cassandra have entertained these past weeks are worth the cost of her aunt's ruin, should this match fail to proceed as arranged." He left the room without waiting for a response, leaving Elias standing alone with a cold, sinking dread settling deep into his chest. He found Cassandra later that afternoon in the garden, and when he relayed the conversation, her face grew pale, though her expression hardened with a resolve he had not fully seen from her before. "He has hinted at this before, though never so plainly," she admitted, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "My aunt's finances have always been more fragile than she liked to admit. I feared something like this might eventually surface, though I confess I had hoped the matter might resolve itself before it came to open threat." "We will find another way," Elias said, though even as he spoke the words, he felt the weight of his own limited resources pressing uncomfortably against the promise. "I will not allow him to force your hand through fear alone." "I appreciate the sentiment," Cassandra said softly, "but Elias, this is not a burden you can simply will away through good intention. My aunt raised me with genuine love, whatever her own struggles. I cannot in good conscience allow her ruin, however much my heart resists the alternative Grenville proposes." They sat together in troubled silence for a long while, the earlier warmth of the garden feeling suddenly distant against the weight of the choice pressing down upon them both. It was the Duke, informed later that evening of Grenville's threat, who finally offered a path forward neither of them had considered. "Lord Grenville's claims regarding your aunt's debts are not entirely accurate," the Duke said, once Cassandra and Elias had explained the situation in his study. "I have long suspected his family exaggerates the extent of the arrangement to maintain leverage over yours, Cassandra. I will have my own solicitors examine the matter thoroughly. If the debts prove smaller than he claims, or if some portion has already been quietly settled through my own family's earlier obligations to yours, his threat loses considerably more force than he currently believes it holds." "You would do that?" Cassandra asked, hope flickering cautiously across her face. "I owe your family a debt far older than any arrangement Grenville imagines he holds over you," the Duke said, his expression firm. "I do not intend to see that old promise honored only halfway, allowing you to be pressured into a match that serves his interests far more than your own happiness." He glanced briefly toward Elias, something almost approving in his gaze. "Whatever unfolds between you and Mr. Whitmore, Cassandra, I would rather see you choose it freely than watch you forced into a lesser arrangement out of fear alone." The following days passed in tense anticipation, as the Duke's solicitors worked quietly to untangle the true state of the debts Grenville had wielded so confidently as leverage. Elias continued his final work on the restored portrait, though his attention remained divided, his thoughts circling constantly around Cassandra's uncertain future and his own uncertain place within it. It was nearly a week later that the Duke summoned them both once more. his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who had successfully unraveled a deliberate deception. "The debts Grenville described have been considerably exaggerated," he announced, setting a stack of documents upon his desk. "A portion was settled years ago through an earlier arrangement between our families, one Grenville's own father apparently failed to properly disclose to him. The remaining sum is modest enough that I am prepared to settle it myself, as part of the debt I already owe your family, Cassandra, through my grandfather's broken promise." Relief flooded Cassandra's face, though it was quickly followed by a flash of anger. "He lied to me. He allowed me to believe my aunt's ruin depended entirely upon a match I did not want. Men accustomed to getting their way rarely trouble themselves with honesty when manipulation serves their purpose more efficiently," the Duke said dryly. "I have already informed Lord Grenville that his claims have been thoroughly examined and found wanting, and that any further attempt to pressure you into an unwanted match will be met with considerably less patience on my part than he has enjoyed thus far." Grenville departed Marlow Hall the following morning, his composure notably strained as he offered stiff, formal farewells to the household before climbing into his carriage without so much as a backward glance toward the woman he had spent weeks attempting to claim through threat and deception. Elias watched from the gallery window as the carriage rolled away down the long drive, a weight lifting from his chest that he had scarcely realized he had been carrying until that very moment. He found Cassandra waiting for him afterward in the garden, her expression lighter than he had seen it since Grenville's arrival had first darkened the household's mood. "He is gone," she said, a note of disbelief still coloring her voice, as though she had not fully allowed herself to trust the resolution until seeing it confirmed. "He is gone," Elias agreed, closing the distance between them. "I find myself uncertain what to do with all this sudden, unexpected freedom," she admitted, a small, genuine laugh escaping her, the first he had heard since the tension of recent weeks had settled so heavily over the household. "Perhaps," Elias said carefully, his heart beating unsteadily against his ribs, "you might allow me the privilege of helping you discover the answer." Cassandra's eyes met his, warm and unguarded in a way that stole the breath from his chest entirely. And for the first time since the strange, impossible dream had first claimed him as a boy of 12 years old, Elias Whitmore allowed himself to believe, fully and without reservation, that the long, uncertain search his heart had carried for 18 years might finally, truly, be nearing its end. With Lord Grenville's departure, a lightness settled over Marlow Hall that Elias had not thought possible when he had first arrived beneath its grand, imposing walls weeks before. The household staff, sensing the shift in mood, grew visibly more cheerful in their daily tasks, and even the Duke, ordinarily reserved in his manner, allowed himself small, genuine smiles whenever he observed Cassandra and Elias together, walking the gardens or sharing quiet conversation in the library that had become their favored refuge. Yet freedom from one obstacle did not mean freedom from every practical concern weighing upon their future. One evening, as autumn deepened toward its final weeks and the restoration work on the portrait stood fully complete, Elias found himself once again summoned to the Duke's study, though this time the conversation carried none of the earlier tension that had marked their first private meeting. "You have finished the restoration beautifully," the Duke said, studying the portrait where it now hung once more in its rightful place within the East Gallery, its damage entirely erased beneath Elias' careful, patient work. "My mother would have been deeply moved to see it return to such condition. I am honored to have restored something that held such meaning for her, Your Grace," Elias said, though he sensed the true purpose of the summons lay beyond simple praise for his craft. "I imagine you understand that your commission here is now technically complete," the Duke continued, turning to face him directly. "Which raises a rather practical question regarding your future intentions, given what has unfolded between yourself and my cousin these past weeks." Elias felt his chest tighten, though he forced himself to meet the Duke's gaze steadily. "I intend, Your Grace, to ask for Lady Cassandra's hand, if she will have me, and if you will permit a match between a Duke's cousin and a village artist of modest means." The Duke studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before something warmer settled into his features. I confess I anticipated this conversation, though I admit I expected rather more nervousness on your part in delivering it. He moved toward the window, looking out over the grounds where autumn leaves had begun to scatter across the lawn in earnest. I will speak plainly, Mr. Whitmore. Your standing is modest, certainly, compared to what many might consider a suitable match for my cousin. But you have proven yourself a man of considerable skill, honest character, and genuine devotion, qualities I have found rather more rare among men of far grander title than yourself. Your Grace. Furthermore, the Duke continued, cutting off whatever protest Elias had intended to offer, you carry a connection to this family that predates even my own claim to it, through a promise my grandfather failed to properly honor in his youth. I find I would rather see that old debt finally settled properly, through the genuine happiness of two people bound by more than mere family obligation, than watch it continue unresolved for another generation. He turned back toward Elias, extending his hand. You have my blessing, Mr. Whitmore, should Cassandra choose to accept your proposal, which I confess I consider rather likely, given how thoroughly she has spoken of you these past weeks whenever she believed herself unobserved. Elias shook the offered hand, relief and gratitude flooding through him in equal measure. Thank you, Your Grace. I promise you will not regret this trust. See that I do not, the Duke said, though his tone carried more warmth than warning. That evening, Elias found Cassandra in the garden once more, seated on the same stone bench where they had first spoken honestly of the burdens weighing upon her heart weeks before. The autumn air had grown properly cold now, carrying the particular sharp cleanliness that came before winter's true arrival, and she looked up as he approached, her expression softening immediately at the sight of him. You look nervous, she observed, amusement threading through her voice. Should I be concerned? Only if you intend to refuse what I am about to ask, Elias said, sitting beside her, his heart beating unsteadily against his ribs despite every effort to remain composed. Understanding dawned slowly across her face, her breath catching audibly as she seemed to grasp the direction of his words before he had fully spoken them. Cassandra, he said, taking her hand carefully in his own, I spent 18 years believing I was chasing a dream I could never fully explain or understand. I filled sketchbooks with your face before I ever knew your name, convinced myself, more than once, that I had lost my reason entirely in pursuit of something that could not possibly be real. But you are real, Cassandra. You have been real all along, waiting somewhere beyond my understanding for the moment our paths would finally cross. I do not know what force guided that dream toward you across all those years, but I know, without any remaining doubt, that I do not wish to spend whatever years remain to me without you beside me. Will you marry me? Tears gathered in Cassandra's eyes, though her smile remained bright and unguarded, the same warmth he had come to treasure more deeply than he had believed himself capable of treasuring anything. I have dreamed of your hand sketching my face for as long as I can properly remember, she said softly, though I never dared hope the dream might lead to this. Yes, Elias. Yes, I will marry you. He drew her close, and for a long moment they simply held each other beneath the bare branches of the autumn garden, the weight of 18 years of longing finally settling into something solid, something real, something neither dream nor distance could ever again threaten to take from them. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Marlow Hall, and though a few among the household's more traditional staff murmured quietly about the unusual match between a duke's cousin and a humble village artist, most greeted the news with genuine warmth, having witnessed firsthand the quiet devotion that had grown between them across the preceding weeks. The Duke himself insisted on hosting the wedding at Marlow Hall, declaring it only fitting that a promise so long delayed across generations should finally be honored beneath the very roof where it had first been broken so many years before. Margaret, informed by an excited letter from her brother, arrived at Marlow Hall a fortnight later, embracing Elias tightly the moment she stepped down from the carriage, tears of happiness bright in her eyes. I told you, she said, laughing through her tears. I told you real things were waiting for you beyond that sketchbook, though I confess I never imagined the real thing would turn out to be quite so remarkable. Neither did I, Elias admitted, glancing toward Cassandra, who watched the reunion with warm amusement from the top of the entrance steps. Though I suppose, in truth, some part of me always knew she was waiting somewhere, even when I could not yet explain how or why. As preparations for the wedding began in earnest, filling Marlow Hall with fabric samples, flower arrangements, and the particular joyful chaos that accompanies any household preparing for a celebration of genuine happiness, Elias found himself returning often to the gallery where his restoration work had first begun weeks before. He stood sometimes before the fully restored portrait of the Duke's grandfather, studying the painted face of a man who had once loved deeply, lost that love to circumstance and family pressure, and carried the weight of that broken promise across the remainder of his life. He felt, standing before that portrait, a quiet gratitude that history, however painful in its original unfolding, had finally found its way toward resolution, carried forward across generations by a dream neither he nor Cassandra had ever fully understood, until understanding arrived exactly when it was needed most. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Elias found himself drawn back to his easel with a new purpose entirely unlike anything that had come before. He had spent 18 years sketching a face born of dreams, fragments captured from a vision he could never fully control or predict. Now, for the first time, he wished to paint Cassandra properly, from life, with her seated before him in the warm afternoon light of the gallery, her true expressions and small, unguarded movements available to him in a way the dream had never permitted. "You seem nervous," Cassandra observed, settling into the chair he had arranged near the tall gallery windows, amusement threading through her voice as she watched him prepare his canvas with unusually careful attention. "I did not think a man of your skill could be nervous over something so familiar to him." "I have painted you 1,000 times," Elias admitted, mixing pigments with hands that trembled slightly despite years of steady practice, "but never once from life. Never once with you actually watching me work, actually present, actually real. I confess it feels rather different than I anticipated." She smiled softly, settling into stillness as he began, the afternoon light catching the particular gray of her eyes in a way no dream, however vivid, had ever quite managed to capture. He worked slowly over the following days, returning to the canvas whenever the light was right, whenever Cassandra could spare an hour from the growing demands of wedding preparation, building the portrait layer by careful layer, much as he had built the restoration of the Duke's grandfather weeks before. He found, as the work progressed, that painting her from life differed from his old dream sketches in ways both subtle and profound. The dream had given him fragments, eyes without full context, a jaw's angle without the warmth of expression that animated it, a curve of dark hair without the particular way it caught afternoon light and shifted color between deep brown and near black depending on the angle of the sun. Now with Cassandra actually present, laughing softly at some observation, frowning slightly in concentration when she tried to hold still too long, he discovered a woman far more vivid, far more real, than any dream had ever managed to convey. "You are staring again," Cassandra teased one afternoon, breaking her pose to catch him watching her rather than working. "I am memorizing," he corrected, though a faint smile tugged at his own composure. "There is a difference, though I confess the two often overlap rather considerably where you are concerned." The Duke visited the gallery occasionally during these sessions, watching the portrait's progress with evident interest, and it was during one such visit that he made an observation that struck Elias with particular force. "Remarkable," the Duke said, studying the near-finished canvas alongside the restored portrait of his grandfather, hung nearby in its rightful place. "The resemblance between your work and my grandfather's own hand is rather striking, Mr. Whitmore. I had not fully noticed it until seeing them side by side." Elias glanced between the two paintings, and felt a slow, quiet wonder settle through him as he recognized what the Duke meant. Something in the careful attention to light, the particular tenderness with which both paintings rendered their subjects, spoke of a shared artistic instinct passed down, however unknowingly, across the generations that separated Eleanor Hale's original heartbreak from the happiness her descendants now stood poised to claim. "Perhaps some things carry forward in the blood," Elias said softly, "whether we understand their origin or not." The portrait was finally completed on a crisp morning just 3 days before the wedding itself, and when Elias stepped back to study the finished work alongside Cassandra, both of them fell silent, struck by what the canvas had ultimately captured. It held all the careful detail of his childhood dream sketches, the storm-gray eyes, the particular tilt of her chin, the small crease that appeared between her brows in moments of thought. But where every dream sketch across 18 years had shown her turned partially away, caught mid-motion toward some distant, unseen destination, this painting showed her facing forward entirely, her eyes meeting the viewer directly, warm and present and fully, finally, home. "She is not turning away anymore," Cassandra observed quietly, studying the canvas with something like wonder in her voice. "No," Elias agreed, slipping his arm around her waist, drawing her close against his side. "I think, perhaps, she finally arrived exactly where she was always meant to be." The wedding itself, when it arrived, filled Marlow Hall with a warmth the great house had perhaps not witnessed in generations. Villagers from Elias' home traveled the considerable distance to attend, mingling with the household staff and the modest number of family connections the Duke had invited, creating a celebration that felt, despite the grandeur of its setting, remarkably intimate and genuine in its happiness. Margaret stood proudly beside her brother throughout the ceremony, tears bright in her eyes as she watched the quiet, solitary man she had worried over for so many years finally claim the happiness she had long believed he deserved, but feared he might never find. The Duke himself gave a brief, heartfelt address during the celebration that followed, speaking openly, for the first time before the assembled guests, of the old promise his grandfather had failed to properly honor, and the quiet satisfaction he felt in watching that broken thread finally mended across the passing generations. "My grandfather spent his final years regretting a choice made from fear rather than courage," he said, raising his glass toward the newly married couple. "I am deeply grateful to have lived to see that regret finally, fully redeemed." Later that evening, as the celebration continued below and candlelight flickered warmly throughout the great hall, Elias found a quiet moment alone with Cassandra near the same staircase where he had first glimpsed her, soaked with rain and utterly unaware of the 18 years of longing that had led him to that particular moment. "Do you remember," he asked softly, "standing exactly here the night you first arrived?" "I remember a strange, pale artist staring at me as though he had seen a ghost," Cassandra said, laughter warming her voice as she leaned against him. "You were the only ghost in that hall," he said quietly, "though I confess it took considerable time to properly explain how alive you truly were." She turned in his arms, studying his face with the same warmth that had first drawn him toward her weeks before, back when she had been nothing more to him than a stranger with impossibly familiar eyes. "I am glad, whatever strange thread of fate or family history brought us together, that it finally led somewhere real." "As am I," Elias said, and drew her close once more, the sketchbooks that had once filled his lonely nights finally, gently retired to a quiet drawer, their purpose fully and beautifully served. Years passed quietly and gently after the wedding, carrying Elias and Cassandra through seasons of ordinary happiness, far removed from the strange, dream-haunted uncertainty that had shaped so much of Elias' earlier life. They settled first in a modest cottage not far from Marlow Hall, close enough that Cassandra remained near the family who had become so central to her happiness, yet independent enough that Elias could continue his work without the constant demands of grand society pressing upon his naturally quiet temperament. His reputation as a restorer grew steadily in the years that followed, aided considerably by the Duke's continued patronage, and the quiet word of mouth that spread among families of standing who valued careful, honest craftsmanship over flashy showmanship. He accepted commissions selectively, preferring work that allowed him time at home, and Cassandra, whose sharp eye for cataloging and provenance had first been discovered during those early weeks at Marlow Hall, became something of a partner in his growing business, her careful research often uncovering details about a painting's history that enriched Elia's restoration work considerably. Margaret married some years later, a kind and steady man from a neighboring village, and the two households remained close, gathering often for holidays and small celebrations that filled Elia's once quiet cottage with the warm, easy noise of family life he had never quite allowed himself to imagine during his solitary younger years. It was their daughter, born some 3 years into the marriage, who first discovered the old sketchbooks, tucked carefully away in a drawer of her father's study on a rainy afternoon when she was perhaps 7 years old, bored and curious and searching for some new amusement to fill the long, gray hours indoors. "Papa," she called, emerging from the study with the wrapped sketchbook clutched carefully in her small hands. "Why do you have so many drawings of Mama, all the same, but from a very long time ago? Some of these are older than you were when you married her." Elias set down the letter he had been writing and looked up to find his daughter, Elinor, named carefully in honor of the great-grandmother whose broken promise had, in some strange and winding way, brought her own parents together across generations. Her curious gray eyes, so like her mother's, studied him with the particular directness only children seem to possess. "Come here," he said gently, patting the chair beside his desk, "and I will tell you a very strange, very true story about a dream I had when I was not much older than you are now." Cassandra entered the study partway through the telling, drawn by the sound of her daughter's delighted gasps at each new detail, and settled quietly into a nearby chair, listening as her husband recounted, for perhaps the 100th time across their years together, the story of a dream that had guided him faithfully across 18 years of uncertain longing, until it finally led him, soaked with rain and radiant with impossible familiarity, through the doors of Marlow Hall. "And then you knew it was Mama," Elinor said, wonder bright in her young voice, "even though you had never met her before." "I knew," Elias confirmed, glancing toward Cassandra with the same warmth that had never dimmed across the years of their marriage, "though I confess it took your mother rather longer to believe me." "I believed you within the week," Cassandra protested, laughter warming her voice, "which I think, given the circumstances, was remarkably quick." Elinor studied the sketchbook a while longer, turning its pages with careful, reverent attention, clearly delighted by the strange romance woven through her own family's history. "Will I dream of someone too, Papa? The way you dreamed of Mama?" Elias considered the question seriously, exchanging a brief, knowing glance with his wife before answering. "Perhaps you will, my darling, or perhaps your own path toward happiness will unfold quite differently. Not every love story begins with a dream, though I confess ours did, and I would not trade that particular beginning for any other, however strange it once seemed to a lonely young man who spent too many years doubting his own heart." Elinor seemed satisfied with this answer, returning eventually to her play, though she carried the sketchbook carefully back to its drawer herself, as though understanding, even at her young age, that it held something precious worth protecting. That evening, once their daughter had been settled to bed, and the cottage had grown quiet around them, Elias and Cassandra sat together near the fire, much as they had countless evenings before, comfortable in the easy silence that only deep, well-settled love allows. "Do you ever miss it?" Cassandra asked eventually, her head resting against his shoulder. "The dream, I mean, now that it no longer comes." Elias considered the question carefully, turning it over with the same thoughtful attention he gave to any delicate piece of restoration work. The dream had indeed stopped visiting him after their wedding night, its purpose fully served, its long journey across 18 years finally, peacefully concluded. He had wondered in the early months of their marriage whether he might miss its familiar visitation, the strange comfort of a vision that had, despite its uncertainty, guided him faithfully toward the greatest happiness of his life. "No," he said finally, drawing her closer against him. "I do not miss the dream, Cassandra, because I no longer need it. I have something far better now. I have you waking each morning beside me, real and warm and wonderfully, permanently present, in a way no dream, however faithful, could ever properly match. Cassandra smiled softly against his shoulder, and outside, beyond the warm glow of their cottage windows, rain began to fall gently across the quiet countryside, the same soft rain that had once brought her, soaked and radiant and entirely unaware, through the doors of Marlow Hall and into the waiting heart of a man who had spent his whole life faithfully sketching the dream that would, at last, become his life.